The Laundering. Volume 2, Case 08, The Crossover. The credential inside cabinet pattern documented in Case 07 is one variant of a broader operation. Governments borrow opposition leaders, technocrats, celebrities, and former adversaries to cover institutional conduct across portfolios well beyond climate. Open the case.
The grammar is the same. The credentials and the files vary. This case names two more credential vectors, the cross-partisan and the celebrity.
Walk it. The credential is the asset, not the activism.
Case 07 named the mechanism using the cleanest available instance, a climate activist placed into the federal environment portfolio whose founding organization sued him over the decision he made there. The instance was sharp because the rebuke arrived in federal court within 5 weeks. But the mechanism is older and more general than the activist instance suggests.
What the institution extracts.
What the institution extracts is not specifically activist credibility. It is outsider credibility. Any reputation generated outside the institution's own machinery that the institution can attach to its own conduct. The activist variant is one source. The opposition party leader is another. The technocrat or celebrity is a third. The retired senior public servant is a fourth. In each variant, the figure brings a record the institution itself could not have generated, and the institution borrows the record to license conduct the record was originally accumulated in opposition to.
The crossover. Ray.
Bob Ray was elected as a federal New Democratic Party MP in 1978. In 1990, he led the Ontario NDP to provincial government and served as the first New Democrat Premier of Ontario from 1990 to 1995. He spent the subsequent decade in legal practice and policy work, then, in 2006, ran for the federal Liberal Party leadership, having crossed the centre-left aisle. He served as interim federal Liberal leader from 2011 to 2013.
And the Trudeau appointments.
From 2017 onward, Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau appointed Ray to a sequence of progressively senior international and humanitarian roles. Canada's special envoy to Myanmar in 2017 in the wake of the Rohingya military operations. Canada's special envoy on humanitarian and refugee issues in 2020. Canada's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations in July 2020. And in 2024 to 2025, President of the UN Economic and Social Council.
The credential the Liberal Party could not have generated.
The credential Ray brings is precisely the one the Liberal Party of Canada could not have generated from inside its own caucus. 2 decades on the federal and provincial NDP, including the only NDP government in Ontario's history, attaches a social democratic and humanitarian biography to whatever file Ray carries. The federal Liberal government, when it needs a senior internationalist face attached to a humanitarian file, can reach across the centre-left aisle and borrow one. The appointment is read as bipartisan seriousness. The credential is in fact partisan, but the partisanship is the other one.
The timing of the UN appointment.
Ray's UN ambassadorial appointment in July 2020 came less than a month after Canada lost its bid for a non-permanent seat on the UN Security Council, defeated on the first ballot by Norway and Ireland. The government had just absorbed an institutional reputational loss and needed a figure whose credential could partially restore the standing of the file. The borrowed opponent credential is well suited to exactly that recovery operation.
What the case does not claim and what it does.
The case makes no claim that Ray has personally laundered any specific Canadian conduct at the UN. The case observes the appointment pattern. The Liberal Party's investment in placing a former NDP leader into successive humanitarian and internationalist roles draws on credibility the party could not produce from its own caucus on the same files at the same speed. That arbitrage is the laundering, regardless of how the figure conducts the role.
The celebrity-technocrat, Garneau.
In October 1984, Marc Garneau became the first Canadian in space. He flew on 3 space shuttle missions between 1984 and 2000. From 2001 to 2005, he served as president of the Canadian Space Agency. In 2008, he was elected to federal parliament as a Liberal MP. From November 2015 to January 2021, he served as Minister of Transport, and from January to October 2021 as Minister of Foreign Affairs.
The celebrity-technocrat vector.
The Garneau credential vector is distinct from both the activist and the cross-partisan variants. It is celebrity-technocrat, a pre-political record of nationally iconic scientific and engineering achievement accumulated in roles that have no partisan signature. The Canadian public knew Garneau as the first Canadian in space for 30 years before they knew him as a Liberal MP. That recognition attaches to whatever portfolio he occupies and confers a particular kind of legitimacy on the institution: competence, calm, technical seriousness, national iconic stature, distinct from any partisan or activist record.
And when the credential becomes load-bearing.
The point at which the credential becomes visibly load-bearing for the institution is the January 2021 cabinet shuffle, when Garneau was moved from transport to foreign affairs, at a moment when the foreign affairs file was in distress. The 2 Michaels detention by China was active, the US transition was uncertain, the Security Council bid had just been lost. Maclean's coverage of the appointment framed it explicitly as the calm hand of Marc Garneau. The credential of calm, not the policy direction, was the asset the institution needed.
And the post-cabinet acknowledgement.
Garneau also produces the crossover connection to a parallel pattern, the retrospective acknowledgement. In July 2024, after he had left cabinet and politics, Garneau publicly stated that Trudeau had overestimated Canada's impact abroad. A substantive critique of the foreign policy posture of the government he had served as Foreign Affairs Minister. The acknowledgement, as in McKenna's case, arrived only after the institutional cost had already been paid.
The pattern by vector.
3 instances, 3 credential vectors, 1 grammar. Activist. Case 07 Anchor. Stephen Guilbeault. Environmental movement credential applied to the federal environment portfolio, while the portfolio approves new offshore oil. McKenna and Carney as climate file comparators on adjacent vectors. Cross-partisan. Case 08. Bob Rae. Social democratic and humanitarian credential generated in the federal and provincial NDP applied to internationalist files by the Federal Liberal Party. UN Ambassador 2020, UN ECOSOC, President 2024 to 2025. Celebrity-technocrat. Case 08. Marc Garneau. Pre-political scientific and engineering credential. First Canadian in space. 3 shuttle missions. Canadian Space Agency presidency. Applied to the transport and foreign affairs portfolios.
And the variants the case does not name.
The case is not exhaustive. Other credential vectors operate identically and could anchor further instances if pursued. The retired senior public servant, the former diplomat, the corporate and philanthropic credential. Each of these is its own appointment pattern with its own laundering arithmetic. The grammar, outside generated credential attached to inside institution conduct, is the same in every variant.
Why the vector matters.
The activist variant, case 07, is the most legible because it produces visible structural rebukes. Lawsuits from founding organizations, public denunciations from former colleagues. The figure's own retrospective regret. The cross-partisan and celebrity variants are quieter because the constituencies the figure came from do not necessarily mobilize to denounce the figure's conduct in the same way. A former NDP premier serving as a Liberal UN ambassador does not draw lawsuits from the Ontario NDP. A former astronaut serving as Foreign Affairs Minister does not draw denunciations from the Canadian Space Agency. The credential is borrowed without the source community reclaiming it.
And why that quietness matters to the institution.
That quietness is itself the laundering's efficiency. The activist variant pays a visible reputational cost when the figure breaks with their movement. The cross-partisan and celebrity variants pay nothing visible at all because the credential is not attached to a movement that can reclaim it. The institution gets the asset more cheaply.
And why the pattern is harder to name with celebrity credentials.
This is also why the pattern is harder to name when the credential is celebrity rather than activist. A critic who says Guilbeault was an activist and Bay du Nord betrays that biography produces a recognizable structural argument. A critic who says Garneau was an astronaut and foreign affairs decisions under his tenure betray that biography produces a confused one, because no one expects an astronaut's pre-political record to commit them to any particular foreign affairs posture. The credential vector is doing real institutional work precisely because the public has no automatic objection to it.
What the case does not claim. The discipline.
It does not claim that Ray or Garneau personally laundered any specific Canadian conduct. Their performance in office is assessable on its own terms, and the case does not attempt that assessment. It does not claim that cross-partisan appointments are illegitimate. Crossover figures can bring real value to government, and arguments for and against the practice are made in good faith on both sides. The structural observation is what the institution extracts from the practice, regardless of whether the figure or the practice is otherwise defensible. It does not claim that celebrity-technocrat appointments are illegitimate. A first Canadian in space has, on its face, no less right to a cabinet seat than anyone else who wins election.
What it does claim.
The credential inside cabinet pattern, observed in case 07, operates across multiple credential vectors and multiple files. The cross-partisan and celebrity variants are quieter than the activist variant because the source communities of those credentials do not typically mobilize to reclaim them. The institution extracts the credential asset more cheaply in the quieter variants, and the absence of a public structural rebuke, a lawsuit, a denunciation, a resignation, is not evidence the laundering is not happening. It is evidence the credential vector chosen is well suited to absorbing scrutiny.
The activist variant is sharp because the rebuke is visible. The crossover and celebrity variants are durable precisely because they are not.
Both serve the same institution by the same grammar. The strongest version is the version that names the variants without inflating them.
5 statements. True.
Ray carried an NDP credential into liberal humanitarian appointments. Garneau carried an astronaut's credential into transport and foreign affairs. Neither credential was generated inside the Liberal Party. Both were institutionally useful for exactly that reason. The pattern case 07 named on the activist file recurs on every file where outside credential is in supply. All 5 are true. Their relationship is the case.
The credential travels.
It travels because it is useful. It is useful because it was generated somewhere the institution could not reach. The activist credential travels with visible cost. The crossover and celebrity credentials travel quietly. The institution prefers the quiet ones. The figure may not know they have been borrowed. The institution counts on that too.